My very first job in the industry was at this really small gaming company, an indie gaming company in Orlando, Florida. It was a 15-person company, and I was one of 3 artists. So I got to wear literally whatever hat I wanted to wear. My tasks ran the entire gamut of all the art tasks, from rigging to modeling to animation to even doing pitch work and marketing work. I even got to do a little bit of UI coding when my curiosity took me in that direction. Fast forward a couple of years, and I'm working at a large publisher up in Redmond, Washington, and I was hired to do the same thing. I was hired to be a 3D, 2D generalist. But as time went on, I was asked to start specializing a little bit more, and because of the needs of the project, I ended up doing a lot of rigging and technical art very specifically, and then I switched teams to go over into doing concept art. So this was a situation where I was still being a generalist, but in a totally different context. I was really moving from specialty to specialty. And now currently I'm back. I'm lead artist at a local indie studio called Wicked Fun right here in Oakland, California. And so I'm back at the small studio wearing a lot of different hats. So I've been a generalist my entire career, but in different contexts, in small studios and in large studios. And so I've come across a lot of different experiences where people have different ideas and different, well, I would say misconceptions about what generalists are, what they aren't, what they can do and what they can't do, and how they should fit into your team. So generalists are really important because of the way being a generalist relates to creativity. One of my favorite books is called 101 Things I Learned in Architecture School, and there's a quote from it that goes, "An architect knows something about everything, an engineer knows everything about one thing." And I think that you could replace the word architect with engineer, you could replace the word architect with artist or designer in our field specifically. And the reason for that is because creativity as a task, the creative task versus the implementation task, specifically requires that you're drawing from more than one body of knowledge and drawing analogies between those. And that's why it's important to know a little bit about everything. Now, the creative generalist, the reason that's important in the video game industry specifically, and it's important in any industry where there's a lot of cross-disciplinary interaction and a lot of collaboration, generalists very specifically have to work as connective tissue between those different specializations. I have an example actually from when I was working up at Microsoft. The big publisher I was working at was Microsoft. And yeah, not a secret. When I was working there, I was working actually on Connect prototypes. And so this is a lot of R&D, and we're trying to come up with new experiences with the new tech. And I was working as a technical artist on this team. And what I noticed, one of the biggest problems was the technical jargon and going back and forth between the creative team and the engineering team, who had very different language and spoke totally different, were in completely different perspectives and spoke totally different languages. The creative team had a lot of thinking entirely about empathizing with the player, thinking about feelings, thinking about, well, I want to put myself in the space and I want the Connect to make me feel like I'm in the space. And so they're really thinking about empathizing with the player, versus I go over to the engineering side and I'm talking to the engineers and they're thinking purely about nuts and bolts mechanics, how the hardware works, how are we going to get the Z-depth of the player using the infrared camera and put that on the screen, and what's the shader going to look like, and all of those things. I don't have any images of this because I don't have permission to use it. It was all R&D stuff at Microsoft. But what was really important about that situation is the generalist, the connective tissue in that creative team, needed to translate this technical jargon into intention to make sure that everybody was working on the same page. And so that was a really unique experience for me, where I felt like generalists I wasn't just working as a jack of all trades. I was actually connective tissue between these different groups. Now, there's a lot of myths about what generalists are and aren't, and that's one of them, that generalists are, like the unicorn picture. And generalists are jack of all trades and a master of none. And the reason I think that this is really contradictory as a position is because the creative generalist as a personality is somebody who needs to be a lifelong learner anyway. So by definition, and I would say generally creative people and talented people tend towards self-improving anyway. So you've got a situation where people are going to build masteries in their various fields, but the thing that's important about that is that with being a jack of all trades, learning's not a zero-sum activity. right? So whatever you've done, whatever skills you've invested in what you already know, you're not going to lose that by branching out in a new direction. Furthermore, all of those skills as a creative generalist, as working as an artist, or I would say also working as a designer in the video game industry, all of those skills relate to one another. They build on one another. So the concept of jack of all trades and master of none, I think, is really not looking deeply enough into the way learning works. And the other myth is that generalists really lack focus. And I would say to that working from a broad base of knowledge, working from more than one base of knowledge is not the same thing as lacking focus. And also that exploration and that using that broad base of knowledge is required to come up with something new. So, but you put your generalists in a different, this is what I was talking about earlier at the beginning, when you have your generalists in different situations, in different contexts and structures, you're gonna get a different result. So at the big publisher that I was working at, I was doing rigging tasks. I was working on consoles. I was doing rigging tasks and concept art tasks at the same time. I was generalizing, but really I was doing, here's my rigging task, here's my concept art task, and the two don't relate to each other. The current job I'm working in, I am doing exactly the same thing. I'm rigging and concept art, but now this is in the context of doing R&D for our 2D animation system. So this is what we're currently working on right now, is that I'm taking my 2D artwork, my illustrations, and I'm rigging them on 3D planes so that the artwork can deform, the characters can breathe, their faces can turn and turn form, and that it's basically combining my 3D rigging understanding with like 2D painting skills. And you can see there how the same skill set in a different environment has, instead of creating a jack of all trades who lacks focus, you now have somebody who is connective tissue and innovating on your pipeline and bringing those skills together to make something new. Now, as a historical example of that, Ray and Charles Eames, now you might think, oh, Sarah's such a generalist and she's lacking focus, what does this have to do with anything? Product design is very relevant because just like game design, it has all of the same requirements as the game design industry. It has massive multidisciplinary collaboration as a requirement, and it has that need to innovate and constantly be on the edge. And Ray and Charles Eames are designers from the mid-20th century who were very, very, very influential in contributing to a lot of different fields. They were the ultimate creative generalists. Ray was a painter and Charles was an architect, and they had a design firm. If you recognize the design, the Eames chair and ottoman, I mean, they defined an entire look and feel of several decades. They were very, very influential. But they didn't just do product design. They did materials, they did design, they did architecture, they did photography and film. And I think that this film, Powers of 10, if you're familiar with it, is a perfect example of how the creative generalist, what the fruits of a creative generalist labor is gonna look like. So Powers of 10 is a film that Ray and Charles Eames made. And it's a perfect example of how creative generalists make different connections. Because if you're not familiar with the film, you should be, because it's very iconic. It basically tells the story of the scale of the entire universe. And Ray and Charles Eames, they didn't take any of the photos. NASA took the photos of space, and IBM had the microscopic photos. And they didn't do any of the research. But what they did do is they had the interest in design and art and film, and they also had the interest in popular sciences and mathematics. And they brought that together in order to create a short film that ended up being one of the most influential, that nobody had ever seen this when it came out. You're probably familiar now with the shot that starts out at Earth and then it comes slamming down into street level. Like, it's really trope-tacular now. Like, a lot of people use it. But Ray and Charles Eames started that. And that is a good example of how that unique generalist perspective is used to create something new. And so just to give you a more related video game industry example, Valve Software has a great company culture example. When I was working up in Redmond, I got to talk to a couple people who worked at Valve, and I asked them, is it true? Is it really true what they say, that there are no job titles, you can really do whatever you want and work on whatever you want? And they said, yeah, more or less. You get hired for whatever you thought your specific specialization was. You get hired to do rigging or whatnot. But once you get in there, their company structure is that the employees allocate all of their own time however it is that they'd like. and they work on whatever tasks it is that need to be worked. So just like I was saying at the beginning of my talk, they wear whatever hats need to be worn. And what that does is it ends up getting people working outside of whatever they thought their core area was. Now, this image is actually from Valve's company handbook. And if you go online, you can see Valve's company handbook. It has a lot of really great cultural information in it. And this is actually an example of how they move their desks. They unplug their desks from the wall. They have wheels on the bottom of their desks. They move them together into new collaboration tables. They plug everything back in and get back to work. Like, that's literally how they do it, because they have such an open collaboration model that they make their teams based on just whatever the project needs are, and it happens very organically and it happens very spontaneously. Now, something else that Valve mentions in their company handbook is the kind of people that they hire in order to make this sort of egalitarian structure work, and they call those people T people. Who's actually heard of the concept of a T person here? Okay, other people have heard of this. Okay, I got this a lot when I was when I was a younger person in the industry and I was getting a lot of mentorship about how I should specialize and whether I should specialize. A lot of people were telling me, you should be a T person. So if you don't know what that means, it's basically an analogy for your skill set. What it means is the vertical stroke of the T is one specialization that you have, one deep skill. The broad stroke of the T, the horizontal stroke of the T, is your broad, shallower knowledge base that you're drawing from. And so this is the concept of the specialized generalist. And Valve says that they use the specialized generalist in their collaborative culture. And the reason is because they can have people who are specialized enough to make a specific individual contribution, but generalized enough in order to work with the people around them. And Tim Brown, who's the CEO of IDEO, has the exact same opinion about T people, that they're really necessary for collaboration. When you could call a specialist an I person if you're using the same analogy, and the problem or the main criticism with that person is that they can't collaborate with the people. They don't have enough knowledge of what the people around them are doing or what the requirements of the other jobs around them are, and they can't collaborate without having a manager facilitating. Likewise, if you have a generalist who doesn't have enough specific experience, they can't make an individual contribution. So IDEO and Valve and a lot of companies now are using this concept of the specialized generalist in order to build a collaborative culture where people can make an individual contribution and also spread out and understand a lot about what their teammates are doing and be able to collaborate. Now, and the business press went kind of crazy with this. I do read a lot of the business press, and they have a lot of shapes now. They have, no, you can't be a T person anymore. That's not enough. You have to be an E person or an M person. And those are the same thing. It just means that you have more than one specialization, and then all the bloggers are like, wait, no, I'm a Y person, I'm an X person, I'm a Pi person, whatever. That's kind of going a little bit crazy. I think it's a really useful way of describing and visualizing a set of skills and a way of collaborating. But our company, Wicked Fun, the indie studio that I'm working at currently, is building a collaborative culture that focuses more on organically building those skill sets out in whatever direction it is that you want to go. And the reason we prefer to work with, we have a creative process that works with the diversity of generalists and specialists and whatever kind of, I guess you could call them collaboration shapes, T people and whatnot. And we prefer to do that versus forcing people to generalize or forcing people to specialize based on whatever happens to be fashionable or convenient. And so this is an image of what our creative process looks like. This is actually a brainstorming intensive that we did. This fellow right here is my mentor. This is Will Murray, the guy all the way on the end, on the right. That's Will Murray, and he's one of the main illustrators at Wizards of the Coast and works on Magic the Gathering and does a lot of illustration. And he actually has been mentoring me and helping me develop this process. And what's important about this inclusive process is, so what's happening right here is an example. We've got the entire concept art team together, and everybody's sketching. And in this particular exercise, we're concepting characters. And so everybody here who's involved, there are artists here, but there's also designers, there's also producers, there's also story people. There's a lot of other people here, basically the whole team. And everybody's contributing sketches. It doesn't actually matter that their drawings aren't that good. What's happening here is that we're generating a lot of ideas, and those ideas are bumping into each other, which is that necessary part for creativity and collaboration. So it doesn't matter that it's programmer art. We want to put it on the wall anyway. And all of those unique perspectives, those unique all those unique perspectives and ideas and concepts are coming out, and so what ends up happening once we have this big brainstorming session is the more specialized person can take all of those ideas, and then they have a much broader base of solutions in order to build more final artwork. And this is something that we're currently developing right now. And so far, it's been really, really, really successful. We've done this with our concept art, but we also do it with our branding exercises, with our story. When we do our narrative design, when we do our deciding what our company images and branding is going to be like. And the reason we like it so much is because it gives people the ability to branch out organically. And you have the ability, even if, like in this example, you're not that good at drawing, you have the ability to collaborate directly where you have a passion. Let's say you don't draw that well, but you have a passion for the concept art and the artwork and what it's going to look like and the branding, and you can contribute those ideas and that passion and those preferences. And then it's not necessarily as important in this structure that you don't have the specialization to take it all the way through to complete concept art. So, in conclusion, I think that it's really important in our interconnected world in order to build an environment where designers and artists and engineers have the kind of ability to collaborate and generalists can be the connective tissue that they need to be. And I gave you the two different examples of the same generalist in different contexts, in the big publisher context where everything was compartmentalized and siloed off, and how that denies the generalist the opportunity to be the connective tissue that they need to be between the different specializations. I think that if you build an environment that provides ample exposure to a broad range of talents and ideas, then you can use your generalists not as jacks of all trades, but as a way of connecting the dots and drawing from a broad range of knowledge to generate new ideas and innovate. Thank you.
Great, awesome, thank you. Tina, you want to do some questions from the audience? Go for it.
So I am a creative generalist, and I love the T, X, Y, Z, ABC metaphor.
Yeah.
I haven't heard of it before, but that's amazing. I mostly work in a very different field, but I'm looking to get more involved in the tech industry in kind of general sense. Mm-hmm. How do I find and connect with companies that appreciate that and then can see, oh, you've got all the skills, we can use that even though you do more performance art than anything?
Oh yeah, that's a great question, and I totally agree with what the way you phrased your question. How do I find a company that can appreciate that? Because what I noticed was that there are, like I've said with the smaller companies, that they really appreciate having generalists. I don't think that's to say that large companies can't use generalists. I just think that there's a culture problem there where they don't know how to use them properly. So when it comes to that, getting into the industry, I would say that you'll have to look up for a smaller company. But I mean, really, I think that's a misconception. There's this misconception, and people are coming out of school way over specialized because they're being funneled into companies who only you're a square peg that's going to go in this square hole, or a round peg that's going to go in this round hole. And if that's their preference and that's for the sake of efficiency, you're swimming against the tide to try and prove your worth. But I think that there's a lot of people who agree, people who have the kind of experience, who have to, who say, I need people who I can use in more flexible positions or things like that. Like people with art directors with experience have more of that preference, but I think it depends on the culture. And so in my experience, the smaller companies respect the contributions of generalists more. But that's not to say that large companies can't use it. I think that, like I was saying, that the siloing off and just having people do a little bit here, do a little bit there, do a little bit there, isn't as constructive as whatever unique background you have, you're bringing that to your team. And those things are going to be combined with all the new skills you learn, and that creates something new and unique and totally innovative. Like nobody's going to create that except for you, because you're that person. You're making those unique connections. That's something that you need to find someone who can appreciate that, rather than I just want, a rigger and concept artist for the price of one. It's finding that person who can understand and appreciate that. Well, what I did, I specifically did go for the smaller companies, and when I went for the bigger company, I went into console world. It's not necessarily small versus big, as James was mentioning in his previous talk. there's a culture in consoles that tends to be sticking people, and it's very compartmentalized. Versus in casual games, the culture is a little bit more collaborative anyway. And I'm not actually sure why that is. Maybe that's the history of the industry. But yeah, that's how I did it. I looked. There were a lot of people who were in my same position, and we met each other. And like, we're an indie studio, we're small. Like, we don't have, like, we're not sitting on the same pile of cash that Microsoft is sitting on, but we have the space to be what we want to be. So that's the kind of choice that you have to make when you're sorry, I can't give you more specific examples. I did have to go find the smaller studio. Yeah.
Is any question right there? He's coming with the mic.
So my question is, as a generalist, how do you show all this in your portfolio without it seeming scattered?
Well, as you can see from my PowerPoint, I don't. A lot of the stuff that generalists end up doing, like I was working on a lot of research and development. It was stuff that's kind of the tough thing, the sacrifice you have to accept, is that sometimes you don't have, like, you end up being an unsung hero, and you don't have a lot of specific implementation things to show. Like, I was working on a research and development project, so I was we're doing the very beginning of the concept and blue sky and pulling all these different things together, doing experience research and all this different kinds of research. So first of all, I don't, like, that's research stuff, so I can't even show it because I don't have permission to show it. And secondly, even if you get to the end of the project, you've got the guy who's like, I'm the modeler, I modeled all the characters, this is what this looked like, and that's what I did. And they can point to that one thing and say, I did that. And if you can be, I don't, like we were talking about the T people and the specific people earlier, if you can find a sort of secret sauce, it's not necessarily about forcing a specialization or forcing a generalization, but having at least one secret sauce or the one thing that you particularly shine at, not at the expense of having these other curiosities. But that's the thing that you can rely on when it comes to making an individual contribution and saying that you have some kind of individual, like, this is what I actually do here, pointing at it. And so that's really where the T-person concept comes in, is being able to have both of those things and show both of those things. When it comes to my portfolio, like, I ended up having 2 different ones. And that was purely because this was something else to answer your question more specifically. That when I was looking for jobs, and people do need to specifically see, okay, you'll fit here, you'll fit here, you'll fit here, I had to tailor it. I had to be like, this is the concept art portfolio, this is the rigging portfolio, this is more gallery stuff, and all of those things are me, right? I think they all go together, but I have to respect what the culture and the perception of the other people are. But then you do that to get your foot in the door, and you do that in order to get by. And I think that I'm really fortunate that I think the culture is changing, and the culture that I'm working at right now, the company I'm working at right now, they're not that interested in seeing that you fit specifically here, you fit specifically there. They are more interested in the whole picture. And so I'm fortunate for that, but I have had to sort of straddle and present myself in a different way in order to do that, yes.
I actually have a question
Sure.
myself. So it's going to sound like a joke, the lead-in, but it's actually very serious.
Yeah.
What happens when you get a room full of generalists together, right? And so, where is the role for either different personalities to rise to the top and sort of lead that group, or how does an art director sort of deal with a whole group of people who are multi-skilled, right?
So when I think about that, I think it's not a good idea to fill a room full of people who are generalists, and that's why our culture has a lot to do with finding diversity. Like our engineers, it's just like the quote says. I mean, I don't mean to stereotype people, because people can, it be curious in whatever field they want to be, but our engineers are more specialized, and our designers and our story people and our artists are more generalized, and that is probably just natural. But when it comes to a room full of generalists, this is actually some of the critique on Valve's culture. Valve has a little, like, there's gives and takes, and one of the critiques of their culture is that they don't really know what to do with new people. And that's one of the problems when you have this room full of, like, a bunch of generalists. They either have to be totally self-directed, or what are you going to do with them? And they have, like, some personality click problems because of that. You end up, when you don't have that sort of leadership structure and, like, I own this spot versus I own that spot, what ends up happening, and this has been some of the, I mean, I don't mean to quote hearsay from disgruntled employees, but what a lot of people have said is that there's a little bit of like a high school attitude there. And I don't mean to sound disrespectful, but I think what ends up happening is you do get personalities taking over when there's not enough people having a specific space kind of carved out. And that's sort of a learning. I mean, I really admire Valve as a company, but one of the learnings that I took when I started developing as our own creative team was that there needs to be a little bit of structure. There needs to be like, okay, we're all generalists and we all have our different personalities and our different specializations, but nobody's going to be a perfect square. Like if we go up to back to the T position, like everybody's going to have a special sauce. Like you have a background and you have a degree and everybody's specialized at least a little bit. And so our structure gives people the ability to have their own space. Like like that concept artist who's taking all those ideas and now using them, like you don't want to interfere with, like they're hired to do their work. Like that's the thing about a specialist. Like they're there to do that job specifically. And so when you have that person who's coming in, now I'm going to be a specialist and now I own this space and I don't really want other people to interfere with that. That's a really important space to carve out also, because one of the critiques with Valve's culture is that a lot of projects that are too new get axed in peer review. And that's because you've got all these people who don't really work together that often, coming together and seeing like, oh, this is an ugly prototype and I don't understand what I'm looking at, and then they say, they axe it. So that those people who are working on that ugly prototype, they need that space, and not to have a bunch of generalists in the room saying, you get what I'm saying, right? And so my first recommendation would be that that you need diversity. Like I'm just a proponent of diversity in general. Our company has a lot of gender and sexual diversity, as well as different types of specializations. But then also, people need a space. Like, people need ownership. Otherwise you have people, like you will end up with people stepping all over each other's toes, too many cooks in the kitchen, and not any clear idea of who owns what. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.